Have you ever wondered if you're on the right track, on your path to financial freedom or building wealth? Where should you be with your money depending on your age? Well, I recently did a video on the 9 things that you need to have in place by age 50. And someone came back to me and says, well, what about 40? What do we need to be thinking about by the time we get to age 40? Well, in this video, I'm going to break it down for you. I'm going to give you the 9 milestones that you need to have in place by age 40 to make sure you're on track with your money, with your finances, and on your path to financial freedom. Welcome to this episode of the Affluent Entrepreneur Show. Let's go do this. All right, welcome back to this episode of the Affluent Entrepreneur Show. In this episode, I'm going to break down the 9 financial goals you should be trying to hit by the time you're age 40. Now, this is a follow-up to a prior episode that I did when I talked about that at age 50, and some people came back and says, what do I need to do at age 40? Well, I got your back in this one. We're going to break it down for you. You're going to see some of it is going to be similar, but much of it is going to be different. Here's what we know. You're age 40, and when you start to get into your 40s, this is kind of like the millionaire's decade, is the way I look at it. It is the decade of transition. In fact, they say that statistics show that most people hit their first $1 million around late 40s, age 48, 49. Now, here's the thing that I think starts to transition here, and I say it's a time of transition. The 30s are what we call the messy middle. This is when stuff is happening in our lives, like family is growing, we're buying a house, there's additions to the family, and there's all kinds of things. But 40 is a time where you ought to be adulting. And I'm not saying that adulting's fun. My wife doesn't think that I'm going to be 63, but she constantly says, "Go, you act 12." Now that's okay because I'm going to always be a kid, and you should always be a kid and be playful and have fun. But know that as you stand in your 40s, depending where in the 40s you are young enough still to remember the earlier years, your 20s and your 30s, and some of the things that you got a chance to do. You're also old enough to possibly look at the horizon and see, wait a second, the idea of retirement actually isn't so far off anymore. The idea of my golden years isn't so far off anymore. This becomes the tipping point. This decade becomes the tipping point of where you start to look at and say, have I done enough right to set me up in my 50s, 60s, and 70s and beyond? And if you haven't, this is the time to get real serious with getting it dialed in and put together. And I'm going to walk you through the 9 goals to make that happen, because this is a time frame in people's lives usually where things start to shift. Your kids are growing older. You're looking towards college expenses. You maybe are already in college expenses. Those get pricey. You might be also in that sandwich kind of era where you're trying to take care of kids that are growing and you're trying to take care of parents that are aging, which puts you in a precarious position financially, because trust me, for someone who is trying to care for an elderly mother who's been on dialysis and is 90 years old, it gets costly. I see the numbers, okay? Now, so this is an interesting era and decade for you to try and balance the desires of today, the needs of tomorrow, and making sure that you're serving all the different things in your life. The kids, the parents, your relationship, and your dreams. So it's an interesting dynamic. Now, there are 9 things that I want you to focus on, 9 goals that I want you to try and hit by age 40. The first one, which I think I start with all the time because of the way I see finances. The bottom line is this: I want you to have an unshakable foundation. That means that I work from safety first, growth second. Okay? Because if we're going to try to build wealth, if we're going to try to build freedom, we don't build it on a bed of sand. We don't build it on a shaky foundation, because one strong wind and it's gone. I want to make sure that you are put in a place where you're stable, you've built it on a solid foundation, and even if there's a strong wind, it may leave a mark, but it isn't going to absolutely destroy you. Okay, so the first element that we need to think of is this idea of liquidity. Now, I say this all the time, but this is really important, because if you're going to survive any kind of downturn, if you're going to survive any kind of problem, you got to have the liquidity to do it. The problem with it is that if we do not have enough liquidity, this is when we start to go into debt that is uncontrolled. It is panic debt. It becomes destructive debt, because we don't have options. So we need to take the time to build liquidity. Now, in the wealth priority ladder, which I talk about in detail in my book, I break all of what I'm talking about in my newly released book, Building Your Money Machine. You should have it if you don't have it. But the bottom line is this, is that it is something that we need to focus on. Now, I tell people that as much as some folks will say, oh, you need 3 to 6 months, I think that that's wrong. I think that's too short, depending on your situation. I think that you should be playing with a 9 to 18 month window, okay? 9 to 18 months. Now, some people will say, oh my God, 18 months of cash? Now, mind you, look, I want it in a high yield savings account, okay? Right now, you can get between 5 and 5.5%. It'll go down at some point, but it's not going down yet. But why do I say 9 to 18 months? It's because I think it takes us longer to get on our feet than we anticipated. And where you land in that 9 to 18 months is really dependent on facts and circumstances. I am not dogmatic about it. I am saying use these as boundaries, use these as guideposts, because let's say, for instance, you're 45, okay, at 45 years old, and you're the sole income earner in your family, and you have 2 kids and a spouse, okay? You have a family of 4 that is depending on you, and you're the only income earner. If God forbid something happens, you lose your job, or there's a downsizing, or you have a health issue like I had, what do? Okay, 9 months may not be enough for you. You might push to 10 or 12 months to make that happen. Now, maybe it's different. Maybe you have no kids, okay? And you have 2 incomes in the household, and you're living off of 1. Well, now you might push it down to the 9 months or less. If you're older, we'll push it up a little higher. If you have unique circumstances around your job, in other words, it's hard to get a job like yours. It'll take a long time, and there's a long lead time to the interview process. Then you might push it out. All I want to do is I want you to concentrate on building liquidity and making sure that you have enough cash to sustain yourself should something unexpected happen that is prolonged. That is prolonged. If you want to truly understand how to do this, I want you to follow the steps in the wealth priority ladder in my book, Building Your Money Machine. And so you want to grab that book at yourmoneymachinebook.com if you get a chance, and go through it. Now, that leads me to number 2 in this process. Number 2 is debt management. Okay. Now, what I mean by this is that it is really important for you at this stage, especially in the 40s, to start making sure that you're dialed in with your payments. Now, I am one, you've heard me say this before, I don't believe all debt's the devil. All debt has 2 personality traits, okay? All debt has 2 personality traits. All debt costs, okay? That's called interest. You're going to get charged interest, okay? And all debt, the second personality trait, is that all debt stresses. Okay. It stresses you financially. It stresses you psychologically. It stresses you throughout whatever it is you're doing. And so you have to realize that that is a trait, whether it's good debt, bad debt, doesn't matter. It's still something that's going to impact you going forward. And so it becomes really important to look at it. Now, what's the difference between destructive debt and productive debt? Destructive debt is the debt you use to finance your lifestyle. It is luxuries, it's consumables, it is all those things that are momentary pleasures of that go away. It's the big screens, it's the vacations, it's the cars that you can't afford, so you have to finance for 7 years. Don't do that. This is a time to completely avoid that debt. This is also a time to look at it, and you follow the wealth priority ladder process. If you are in debt, if you have that kind of debt at this time, this is a time to make sure that you are on a debt payment plan to get it paid off. Because as you get into your 50s and 60s, at some point, I want you completely debt-free. I don't want that stress on you. I don't want that cost on you. Okay. And we can talk about mortgages another time. When do you pay those off? But it is important to look at it through those eyes. Now, productive debt. What is that? Productive debt is debt that you use to build your net worth or build additional cash flow. It increases your wealth and increases your cash flow. This might be debt that you use to buy a rental property. Okay. It might be debt you use to buy a piece of equipment that you rent. Okay. But it isn't debt that you use to finance a vacation. That is a consumable. Okay. So number 2 is, 1, avoid destructive debt, and then get a debt management plan in place if you have destructive debt, and start to get control of the debt. That leads me to number 3. Okay. Number 3 is, I want to make sure that you're fully funding your future. What does that mean? What I mean by this, and when you see me talk about it in the wealth priority ladder, we work from comfort fund, we do the destructive debt and the peace of mind fund, and then we do investing. The freedom fund is what I call it. That freedom category in the wealth priority ladder, I want you to start funding 20 to 25% of your income into investments. And we can talk another time about the investments. The first thing is that the investments don't matter if you're not funding it. In your 40s, if you have not been fully funding investing to the tune of 20 to 25%, it's time. It is time, because now you're starting to lose time to help you build wealth. Think about this. Every dollar that you put away at 20 years old turns into $80 by the time you retire. If you wait 5 years, that's cut in half. It goes to 40 times. If you wait another 5 years at 30, it goes to 20, 23 times. If you wait till 40, all of a sudden it's close to 7 times. Bottom line is, you got to get yourself in the game at 40 years old. It is really important that you are fully funding your financial future. Fully funding your financial future. What accounts you put it in and that type of thing, I talk about it in the book. Get the book, walk through it. It literally tells you, do you put it in a Roth? Do you put it in an IRA? Do you put it in 401k? Do you put it in a brokerage? When do you do real estate? I literally give you the whole recipe, but the important thing for you is to make sure that you're funding it, because it doesn't matter where you put it if you're not funding it. Let's get you funding it first. So number 3 is fully funding your financial future, okay? Number four is actually knowing your target. Where are you going? What's your destination? Now, I'm going to walk through a formula here, and I did it in a prior video. This is not my formula. Okay, this is a formula that came originally from the Millionaire Next Door. Okay, and the Millionaire Next Door is a classic book on personal finance that walks through, the things to consider in doing it. Now, in that book, they talk about the average accumulator of wealth, the AAW, and there's a formula that they bring in there, and then what that is your income times your age divided by 10. Let's just look at a 45-year-old. So you're 45 years old And at 45 years old, let's say you're making $100,000 a year. So using their formula, this tells you that your net worth should be $450,000 because 45 years old times 100,000, that gives you 4.5 million, okay? That gives you 4.5 million. Divide by 10, and that gives you 450,000. Now, they also talk about this idea of a prodigious accumulator of wealth, someone that's an overachiever, which I know y'all are. And what they do is they take this and multiply it by 2. So a prodigious accumulator of wealth would be $900,000. What this number represents is what your net worth should be. $900,000 as a prodigious accumulator, 450,000 as an average accumulator of wealth. Now, there has been criticisms of this, and anytime you put some generic, general formula in place, it's not going to fit every situation. And we're talking about you in the 40s. And so if you're under 40, then we want to look at it slightly different. And this is a tweak and an adjustment that was made to this formula by my dear friends Brian Preston and Bo Hansen. And what they did is they took the same formula. And they said income times age divided by 10 plus the years to age 40. Okay, so let me run the numbers for you. Let's assume that you're 35 years old and you still have the same $100,000 of income, okay? What that means is you take 35 times the 100,000, and that leads to $3.5 million, okay? Now, you're going to divide it by 10 plus the number of years before you're 40. Well, that's 5 years because you're age 35. 40 minus 35 is 5. So divided by 10 plus 5, so divided by 15. That means that if we divide it by 15, your average accumulator for under 40 would be $233,000, okay? If you're a prodigious accumulator, multiply it by 2, that gives you $466,000. So round it up. If you're at 35 using this formula, you're going to want about $250,000 or $500,000, depending on where you're at. But the point is this. You got to know where you're going. Otherwise, you don't know how to get there. You know what your current situation is, but you don't know where you're going to. You never know when you cross the finish line. It is important for you to know where the finish line is. This is a ballpark. This is generic or general, but it is a starting point. As you get closer, as you start to refine your money journey, your financial journey, you will get more and more precise. I sit with my wealth team regularly. We either do it via Zoom or via calls on almost a monthly basis. We'll have a conversation, but more meaningful, at least every 6 months, typically every quarter, where we break it down and say, are we on track? Do we need to make some adjustments? So know that this step is really setting a ballpark target that gives you a direction, but it requires you to refine it and get more and more precise as you go down the road, which now leads me to the fifth thing that you need to have in place. And the fifth thing is that if you know your target, okay, then you just need to start thinking about a definitive plan, okay? Do you have a plan to get there? You now know, that means spending plan, an investing plan, an income plan, all of it put together to say, I am here, this is where I want to go, this is the gap in between, and this is my plan to get there over the next 10, 15 years. Because you're in your 40s, you probably have a couple of decades left where you might say, I want to keep working as hard as I am. Maybe you don't. Maybe you sit back and say, I want to get this done in a decade. Great. You got to have a plan to get there. Remember, you start with the vision in your life. The vision will define the plan. The plan will set the strategy. The strategy will help you determine the tactics, and the tactics will put in place the action items to take. But we got to get this plan in place. And too often at this point, people are just kind of floundering. I don't know. I don't really have a specific plan. No, we need to get a plan in place. Now, this is where we start to look at things a little differently, and that is starting to understand the things that might drive your wealth, maybe a little deeper in the sense of how to really drive the protections, transitions, the things in life. Because remember, I said you've got kids that are probably growing up and probably on the way out of the household. You've got parents that are getting older that you might have money coming in from, maybe not, it doesn't matter. But what does that transition look like? If you haven't started having these conversations with your family, it's time to have them. I think you should have them much earlier, but we want to make sure that everyone is on the same page, doing the same thing, doing the right things to make that happen. And so this number 6 is kind of an offshoot to the plan, and that is, what does the transitions look like? Do I need to put things in place like a trust? And I'm hoping that you have a trust before this. But if you don't have a trust and a will, this is the time to really start to dial it in, and everything. You might make and review your insurance in this category too. Do I need more life insurance? Is this something that I can lessen lives, or where am I on what we're really trying to do? Now, this is also the time where we go to number 7, where I think that this is the time to get really clear on your values and how to make sure that they are carried out after you. Here's what I mean by this. You took the time to get yourself here. You're starting to build wealth. You're in that millionaire decade. How are you going to turn around and make sure that it is sustainable and that the people around you are going to carry it out? My wife and I have had multiple conversations around my vision around the money machine that I talk about and building and all that stuff, and her vision for the money machine, so we can be on the same page to make that happen. Too often, you have one person in the relationship possibly that's driving the bus. I'm not in a relationship alone. I'm in a relationship with my wife, so I need her side by side with me on this bus, and she gets a voice. She has a conversation. This is about us creating a vision for a life. And so I want to make sure that we're on the same page. That then allows you to start looking at number 8. And number 8 is, what do you need to learn? So this is really about your education. Because here's what's happening right now. You spent your 20s and your 30s all about income, all about income, all about income, all about income. I got to make income. But what are you doing to use the income effectively and to steward it? Because you're now going to start to transition from the become wealthy kind of mindset, behaviors, and attitudes to the stay wealthy behaviors, mindset, and attitudes. And they're different. They're different traits, they're different skills, they're different elements that need to be in place. That means that the stuff that got you to earning the wealth isn't the stuff that's going to preserve the wealth, to steward the wealth, to keep it going. And so there may be some things that you need to understand and learn about yourself, about your needs, about managing a portfolio. Not that you're going to, like, I've got a wealth team that manages the portfolio primarily, but they don't do it without me. I don't relinquish responsibility. I don't ever want you to relinquish responsibility. And so that means that you need to understand things like risk management, risk mitigation, and this is where you start to have more conversations around that. You've shifted from you're starting to shift. You haven't shifted completely, but you're starting to think about preservation strategies. How do I limit losses? How do I make sure that I'm not taking undue risk? All those things come into play to do that. And then number 9 is those people that are going to steward this beyond you need to gain some skill sets before they ever get the assets. So the same education that you are talking about and learning here in number 8, you've got to be able to communicate that in number 9. So when you're starting into this decade, there's a lot of moving parts in the millionaires decade, in this 40s decade, because you got to have the liquidity for safety. You've got to make sure that you've got control of your debt. You've eliminated or you're eliminating your destructive debt. You're not getting buried in debt. So you've got that. You're fully funding your financial future by 20 to 25%, following the recipe in the wealth priority ladder in my book, Building Your Money Machine. You have an idea of what your target is. If you don't have a specific number, use the AAW calculation, the average accumulator of wealth and prodigious accumulator of wealth calculations that I showed you here, so you know that. And you have a plan to kind of get you there, to bridge that gap, because now you're going into your next decade, the 50s decade, which I've talked about before, and then 60s and 70s. And now you're also looking at the transitions that are coming, transitions with the kids, transitions with the parents, to make sure that you're set up on that, and that your partner is skilling up along with you, because you're moving from into a space where preservation starts to become more of a priority. It's not the priority yet, because you still have plenty of decades to accumulate and build. In fact, you're just starting, but I want you to have a mind towards preservation, and then asking yourself, what skill sets does everyone else need to have to be able to earn the right to have the wealth and steward it beyond you? That's it. That's it. Now, that's plenty. But the 40s is a critical tipping point on your financial journey, because there is a lot of stuff that is changing. You have in vision the past of your younger years of earnings and growth and building a family. And you also have in the future the vision and the possibility of your golden years, your ability to retire. It's now you can see both sides of the equation when you're in this decade. And so we got to think about both sides of the equation. I hope that this helps. I hope that gives you something to think about as you move forward, and that you follow this checklist to see where you are on your journey and what kind of goals you should be thinking about hitting by the time you're age 40. All right. I look forward to seeing you in another episode. I look forward to seeing you on the road as I speak. And until then, always strive to live a life that outlives you. Cheers.